So history doesn't come from PPT or Google. History comes from travel. I'm very clear about it. PPT and Google can make me feel I must travel. That's all. But I think history is not Google and PPT. So thank you for the invitation, and maybe I have to begin with saying that this is my first visit outside home after social distancing, and so this is the first time I'm in a group with more than 2 people. I know the world moved ahead, but I was a little slow in catching up, and I have to thank architect Mohe for this. I was wondering how to get back into the world. I was enjoying this whole, of course, thank Rowan Builders, Lunkadji. The presentation, I think there's a whole thanking to be done because it was just simply amazing with Rowan Builders, then Mindspace, Shweta was there, Rucha, Prajakta, so many others all involved. And to have I would just say the opportunity of having Sachin and Henry, very short notice. Henry came down from South Africa. We've been very close friends virtually and just met in physical now. But it really looked as if we met each other for a very long time. And so was also with Rucha and many of the others. So it's been a wonderful experience. This theme, I'll just go broad. I'm just going to say something, and if it sounds a little vague, bear with me. That's how we are taught in SEPT. So, Gandhi Ashram. Yeah, this is where my formative years began at SEPT. And took some time to understand this building. Appears simple. It took some time to understand this building. And so when architect Mohe called me, and I think he mentioned that Shweta and a few others had kind of put this together, I was looking back at the fact that maybe the 2 years of pandemic was a very deep inflection in human civilization itself. I'll come to that a little later. Though when you land in Pune, you think you over intensified or you've been hyper intensive because it's as if nothing happened in the last 2 years. But from where we are, even now masks are checked and e-pass and all that. We've come to Pune, I wonder whether there was any pandemic. That is how I'm looking. But that's how it was. But the manner in which they framed this context, this initiative, I don't want to call it competition, this initiative, was that it was specific enough to give us some idea of where we want to go, and yet open-ended enough for diversity of freedom. And that's how I've seen architect Charles Correa's work. And I've had the good fortune of knowing him for a very long time because I was from Goa also. That there is a certain specificity, there's a certain rigor and discipline, but with that there is an open-ended freedom. And I think it's a profound architecture. Each time I go back, I see that it's not a frivolous something, but it is built over time. There's a rigor and yet escapes the rigor, and I think that's what almost all his projects convey. And I think architect Mohe, his team, Shweta, and all of them managed to capture that idea in the idea of a memorial, and which is one reason I accepted this, because there were many layers for me also to get back into the world. One was that I grew up in Goa, I'm from Goa, knew Correa well in various forums, and this kind of a memorial, I didn't see it as a memorial per se, but it was really a question of remembrance and context. So I'll try to it's all single sentences from now on. I'm just giving a brief. So remembrance and context, it's straightforward written there. Why do we need to remember? That's how when I take history and studio, and for the last 30 years it's not separate. History is part of studio as one subject. I've taken it that way. So history and studio. So when we talk to students, we ask, or why talk to ourselves first, then the student overhears. Why do we need to remember? Can we not forget the past? Is this not a completely new future? We have metaverse, we have augmented reality. So what really is the role of remembrance or history or heritage? So these are all questions that one kind of thinks. But then you ask, what is the role of continuity? How does continuity work, where you remember the past and yet respond to the... And I think these are areas, or these are the nodes in which architect Charles Correa had a very deep, he would call it the deep structure, had a very deep engagement of, and yet there was amazing humor. There was always there was a humor in the work despite that kind of a rigor. And I think that combination is something which has always drawn me back to his work. So this is the kind of landscape I grew up in, and it somehow resonated with the design competition. And so there was the sea and the openness at one level. You just see the sea and you see the horizon, you see infinity. At another level, you are in these small towns which are looking like carved out. So you don't really see any object as architecture. These are carved out spaces. So suddenly the void, the public space, becomes as important, if not more important, than the building. But our education generally pushes us to think of the building, building in a site, building. And so we are all the time thinking building. But I think, this is my surmise, architect Charles Correa was thinking of the void, what is not there. And in trying to make what is not there, the building would kind of come and maybe support the system. It was a complete inversion of architecture. Now, this is my interpretation, and I speak whatever I want. I wouldn't request you to accept what I speak. So there is a void, that architecture is the celebration of that void where nothing happens. So if you look at Jawahar Kala Kendra, I see only the central courtyard. The rest I see, okay, if I have time, I would go around. It is always the void that generates that celebration. And between where I grew up, this was the street where I grew up, and the company was, of course, there were students also, but in this picture, there are only buffaloes, and that was the kind of company. We would play football, and within an hour from where we went, so you can see this is where I am right now. Again, between Chennai and Orwell, a very similar landscape in certain ways. But if you see, and I think Sachin's presentation in a way invoked this in a very, without stating it. But in all my conversations with Charles Correa, I found that the breadth of, he was into art, he was listening to music, cricket commentary, because when he grew up, there was only these small radios. And if I spoke to Charles Correa about 60s and 70s cricket, there was no TV or anything. He would remember every commentary on the small transistor set that he had. So you imagine, it makes an architect now imagine the entire game. So you have to have a very good commentator, because nothing visual, and you're listening to the radio. That's how we grew up, and I'm sure architect Mo and all realize that the commentary. So you start visualizing inside the mind, and painters like Shiriko had a deep impress. From here, I'm just coming to the idea of construction and material, act of making. Some clay, lift a brick, coconut, just making. This is after the Gujarat earthquake, and where we are located, we have invited several crafts people, craft communities who come, and so all our projects we're making our own flooring, tile. Many times the client itself on a Saturday, Sunday is making the tile for his room. So he feels he did the whole thing. So we're doing this with which we think are traditional crafts, but we're not doing it with an idea of tradition. We're doing it as it's a living culture. And if one reads Charles Correa, he's very clear, because something new came today, a new technology, doesn't make what is existing old. We think it is old. It is not of our time. If it is living, it is living. If we go into Rajasthan or something, these are living cultures. So as architects, how do we explore the coexistence rather than look at a sequential time, and that's something but if we work, we tend to think, if I use terracotta, I use something, the materials start conveying meanings. I think we've been trying to re-examine, are those meanings real, or are those meanings imported from the Bauhaus? I have nothing against the Bauhaus, but have they been imported from Europe, which we are borrowing? When in India, I think we are living simultaneous cultures. In the morning, I wake up and I meet a person from the 3rd century sometimes. I have lunch with a person in the 12th century. And in the evening, I'm maybe 21st or 22nd century, because someone is into augmented reality. And all this is happening in a single day, several centuries. So I think that's the quality in which India is living, as I see. So materials, so many choices. Yesterday at the dinner, Lunkarji was showing flowers, nature and flowers. How many varieties? And I was asking, can my mind even attempt to imagine the varieties? So to me, these varieties, the flowers we saw there at the farm, and then the materials you see, to me are as amazing, if not more amazing, than metaverse and augmented reality. It's simply amazing, that if you open it, it's a metaverse unto itself. So nature is already busy, actually not busy, very relaxedly doing its metaverse. And that is how materials happen. So most of our work, and this is for the last 30 years, so we've had a difficulty explaining that could also be within the realm of architecture, though it's catching up now. Most of our work was constructing homes with different remote villages. We must have constructed about 50 or 70,000 homes now for the last 25 years. But working with communities, studying what technologies or what building construction has happened over centuries, and then maybe introducing them to Orwell at times, introducing them to Laurie Baker, kind of collaborated on our projects quite a few times, and we were honored by that. So these are all village communities that we were, and we built about 30 or 40,000 houses. Each house costs, at that time, this is 10 years ago, about 90,000 rupees, and all the bricks were made there, all. So that's the kind of, even the planning, the village planning, the water, the rain. So you'll see the trees are all intact and the houses move, and a lot of animals who are part of the family. So the whole imagination of what is home, imagination of how do you do a plan, how do you do an urban plan, happened in a very accretive manner. And one did have a little difficulty explaining it. I'm probably explaining it now for the first time in 20 or 30 years, because I myself was not sure how to explain it. I was quite sure this may be a way of looking at an architecture without architects, but not too sure how to discuss it. So if we see Gandhi Ashram and Laurie Baker, and I think this is again my personal opinion, among architects, I think Charles Correa had one of the most profound understanding of Gandhiji, and from which I have deeply kind of ingrained and understood on how to understand this connection with materials. It's almost like a Japanese carpenter. You meet a Japanese carpenter, he can hold wood, close his eyes and tell you which part of the wood is root, which part was bark when it's cut from the tree. Now imagine that kind of a conversation with materials. It takes time. And I think Gandhiji understood that quite deeply, and Laurie Baker, of course. So this is the kind of, when we go into the village, this is what we see. Centuries of knowledge. So we were finding it very difficult to come with our Ahmedabad knowledge. I have nothing against Ahmedabad knowledge, and come and place it on a village, or place it on, we found we had to invert that. So this inversion is happening very slowly, but I think it's fine. So when the pandemic happened, I'm coming to the inflection. When the pandemic happened, I asked my students, pre-pandemic, if there was a Saturday, Sunday, where were you? So we would go trekking, we would go to Orwell, We would go this. So I exaggerated it a little. I said pre-pandemic, our home was completely empty and the cities were crowded. You could see the traffic jam. So the homes are completely empty. They're there. Uh, this is not a pre-pandemic home. I'm just showing it for Balsavar by Correa. But the homes were empty. Cities were full of people. Never in history did the entire civilization sit in the home isolated, having the city empty. Never. Imagine the. So our home became, so the last 2 years of my online conversations became, how can the home become a market? How can the home become a conference room? How can the home, so home was requested to carry the whole world for 2 years. So I changed the curriculum and I told my students, home as the universe. Let's see what happens. And we started discussing, and because it was online, the classroom changed. My students in Assam, Meghalaya, grandmother would come and now sit out of curiosity. Kerala grandmother starts conversing. And I changed the curriculum as discover the home of the pandemic. So whatever they did in the home had to be part of the curriculum. Nobody can fail because we are just saying discover the world in the pandemic. So it changed completely, but this is what we understood, that the home is being requested to take on functions that it was not prepared for. And that's why I feel there is a new way of looking at it. Has affected us deeply. We may not understand it. So the other day I was hearing a podcast on, and for that I have to, since I said podcast, I think Durganand is here, and there was an amazing conversation on that podcast with Durganand. Nimkar is here. And I was listening to another podcast, and the psychologist said, please take everything what I'm saying with statutory warning. I'm just saying what I heard. I have no proof or evidence. So he said that the human race is moving into a new zone, and at some level I did feel maybe you wake up maybe with a high feeling of optimism. Now we have to do something. At the same time, the world outside is saying Armageddon, somebody is saying it may end, third person is saying asteroid will hit, fourth person is saying, have you packed your bags because tomorrow evening we have to go to Mars. You're listening to all that, at one level. At another level, you're thinking, no, optimism, that is true. And at a third level, you're thinking, if all this is happening, why should I work? Maybe I can relax a little. Now, these three emotions are coming at the same time because of the pandemic. Now, this is what a psychologist said. I know it's come often for me also, but I handle it with a coffee or a tea. I don't go to the doctor. But I'm saying these emotions come. It can lead to a depression, it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to all kinds. So we need to understand now as human beings, how are we going to cope with a very high level of unpredictability and instability? Can we cope? I think we can. It's about resilience and how we handle that resilience. So this is the street I grew up in Goa. I'm going to history because history more as memory. I won't say much about it. These were the kind of places we traveled. So history doesn't come from PPT or Google. History comes from travel. I'm very clear about it. PPT and Google can make me feel I must travel. That's all. But I think history is not Google and PPT. So that's another thing which I learned. This is the street in which I lived and grew up. And my father had a kind of a shop office so when I went back, I just thought I'll document this. And so this is the kind of street we grew up. It used to lead to the station. And within half an hour, we would come into the Western Ghats. So my growing up was Pune, Mumbai, Bombay, Goa. And my father would take us in a ship from Goa. It was called Konkan Sevak to Bombay. So we would always go by ship. So every time I go back to Charles Correa's work, I cannot avoid these memories getting provoked because he's pulling the memories from that same kind of a context. And this is the formative context. Now it is Sept, again where my architectural journey began. And in those days, I was a project architect for some extension of IIM, and I think Moe is doing an amazing initiative and design and growing IIM. And these were the kind of references we had. I had measured on the pattern stepwell with Professor Basavda, again, who has an amazing understanding of Gandhiji as well as Charles Correa. So I would say Professor Basavda has a very deep understanding of. So this was the kind of formative context, but this is also the formative context for Indian architecture at some level, you know. I'll run through this quickly. We ask why our cities are hot, and I think we know all these statistics. You can just read any UNDP report whenever you have time. And so I come to the public realm. So our interest, it just happened that now our interest has gone into the public realm, and one leading to other, nothing planned. So we've been now working with cities of Barcelona, Berlin, Paris to a small extent, but more Barcelona, Berlin, Zagreb, and Chennai, sometimes Orville, on this void. What does this void do? How do human beings inhabit this void? And amazingly, what's happening is that you all wonder why I'm called to Barcelona or Paris for this. It is because they've forgotten how to walk. So we've called it walking cities. Everyone now wants to go away from the car, and the pattern and the habit of walking is vanished. And which is why now European cities are relooking at this, and that's the kind of initiatives we're doing. The Roots Dialogue, next week we have another dialogue with Professor Eugenio Palasma. All these dialogues are free. I would request you all to log in, more because of the generosity of the people who are, and I have no reason, I don't understand why, but there's a generosity to dialogue. They come on and they prepare and come, prepare for months and come, and I think I kind of respect the fact that they feel they need to prepare, come and talk for an hour or two, and their time is very valuable. They're busy and still they come. So I would request you that this is a kind of a forum we may have ignited and initiated, but it cannot happen without the generosity of, I would say, reflective practices, thinking practices, and we're thinking and trying to share it, you know, and that's why these are some of the publications we've been involved in. Environment and ecology has become an important aspect, and that's because of our closeness to Orville. So we are trying to grow forests with about 15 universities on fallow land. So the Saturday, Sundays go in that. These are actually very simple tasks. I don't want to put any, it is just you do it, you plant, you come back, you see something happens to you. War and peace, we got drawn into this by mistake, I think. We were working on the tsunami in Nagapattinam and the Sri Lankan war grew up. So since then, in the last 11 years now, we've been responding to war refugees. I remember architect Charles Correa asking me, how is this? Why should an architect be involved in war and peace? Why should an architect be involved in tsunami rehabilitation? So there was a certain perception of architecture, you know, that this architecture which is ephemeral, you're just tying some bamboo or you're doing something like that, why it should be the realm of an architect. But we continued because we needed to understand, and today suddenly everybody is discussing the transitional city, ephemeral city, walking city. But 20 years when we were going back, I know that many of the architects even within the office were wondering whether this is an architect's role. But with climate change, I think this is becoming important. And so then these are few of our projects which we have done. It's like Tata Steel had an ad which said we also make steel, you know. So I wanted to say we also are involved in projects and we make buildings. And but we are a very slow practice. So if I do a project and it takes 4 years, I just do one project for 4 years. If it takes 8 months, then 8 months, one project. Rarely 2 projects unless a close friend is really pressurizing me and his emotions are changing, then I take. But otherwise, it's a very slow practice. This is a resort for the Taj groups done along with Dean de Cruz. It's near Mahabalipuram, very simple building. And there I took the inspirations of Golconda House. So we thought, let's do a 5-star kind of a place without fan and without air conditioning. And with my rural background, I think the client said, let's remove this architect because He doesn't understand that a 5-star hotel needs air conditioning and AC. And we managed 30% no fan, no air conditioning till today. And the rooms have fans. Now in a 5-star hotel you don't have fans. I put that, insisted, and it is working. And the whole structure is in steel, because they came one day and said if it has to be concreted, I have to sign some huge bombing of the entire campus, because there were boulders. And I said I cannot allow bombing of a campus. So we had to redesign, and the soil test that we had got from the university was wrong. We found that there were boulders, and then our structure engineer said we can actually start placing the light steel structure on the boulders. So this was one of our first projects in steel and on the boulders. And so this is the kind of, and this is the monastery I did in Bangalore East. This was my first project. And so it's a monastery where walls are half, it was a monastery for a Assisi group. And now we're doing a theological college there. These are some of the residences we did, many residences. One is a elderly retreat. It's going to begin. And the other is a home for a pilot, which recently was demolished. Again, this home for a pilot had no rooms actually. It was just a pavilion, because they were just husband and wife, children were abroad. So I said, why do we need rooms? So we had no rooms. And so you'll see that there is absolutely no walls. It just walked, and they had memories of their Kumbakonam home. So I tried to see whether we can capture the light of the Kumbakonam. So I'll end with this. I call it the end and the beginning. It is like Vinayak Chaturthi, you have and Professor Doshi often talks to me about it, the Sarjan, Visarjan, the cycle. So it's really the end, and every time is think of an end, and if next time someone discusses Armageddon and all these kind of, that there is a beginning there. That is our region and our subcontinental culture, that there is no end. It will just keep going. Of course, my talk has to end right now, but there is always a beginning, and you look into the horizon. These are the history models that first year make within the first 3 weeks of joining the campus. I know it's quite a controversy, but they make it still, and I continue to make them make it. They say it's too early. Are you making them mature before they've understood? I said there's nothing which is wrong, if you're making. So they make it, they make parts, they break it. They will understand it in the level that they want to understand it. In 4th year, they may come back and say, so what you spoke 5 years ago, just now, it struck me. I said, that's how I also grew up. What something was told in 1st year, yesterday I realized what was told to me. So that is the way memory works. And let us celebrate that memory. There's no time sequence. And the pandemic has told us, if we as a group can handle something as intense in the pandemic, a lot more we can handle. And I again thank Rohan Builders and architect Mohe. I was sitting still in the pandemic. This is the first time I'm coming out. And I saw Pune has no memory of the pandemic. They are moving forward. So thank you again. And I see that as the end and the beginning. Thank you very much.